that there's some good news here, and that is that the new START treaty, the new Strategic Arms Limitations Talks treaty signed under the Obama administration, was actually extended when it went out of business in 2021, and it was extended for another 6 years. So we don't have to worry about that strategic level nuclear agreement until 2026, next year. But these, some people view arms control as an illusion. It doesn't make any difference what people agree to do. They never completely agree to it. But the truth is that both we and the Soviets, and then subsequently we and the Russians, have done a pretty good job of adhering to the various treaties. These treaties have saved us a lot of money, and I think they have also created a climate of what I would call of thinking people that are sensitive to the nuclear issue, want to avoid a nuclear collision at all costs. I think that's the real problem right now. Something has happened, and I'm not sure what it is, both in the senior ranks of the American military as well as in Washington among politicians on the Hill and in the White House. They think that this is something they can play with, that this is something they can maneuver. In other words, the whole threat of nuclear war. The Russians take it very seriously. They are not insensitive to the consequences of blast heat and radiation and the loss of millions of lives. But for some reason, we in the West don't seem to think in those terms. And so the Russians are taking prudent measures. They're going to move weapons closer into White Russia. They've already done some of that, as well as areas in the Western theater near St. Petersburg, north of that. And all of this is in response to things that we've been doing. And remember, we only very recently decided, for reasons that make no sense at all, to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Great Britain, England, in fact. These are weapons designed to be delivered by aircraft against targets like St. Petersburg. So then you look at the Kaliningrad disaster, this general who was the co-architect of the disaster in the Afghan withdrawal, Donahue, a man who spent most of his military career in special ops, where I'm sure he was quite good. I just don't think special ops necessarily prepares you for strategic level thinking and discussions and decision making. But nevertheless, we have no real general staff corps. We have no real meritocracy when it comes to the selection of senior officers. So his statement is frightening, because that's the kind of thing that leads you down the road to a nuclear disaster. And I think whether people realize it or not, we're on that road. I don't think the Russians are bluffing.
Well, in fact, I want to go further. So I just showed you that on the Newsweek there, where it had the Russian Foreign Ministry claim about why they pulled out of this. And then we have this morning, that was yesterday, this morning, Dmitry Medvedev on X just a couple of hours ago, I think, said that the Russian Foreign Ministry statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This new reality, all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So what do you suspect that he may mean about these further steps?
I think his point is that the Russians are not bluffing. President Trump, as we both know, says one thing and 2 weeks later says another. And we know that he responded recently to the statements that Medvedev made in a fit of anger. He was supposedly very angry. And he deployed 2 submarines to positions closer, presumably to Western Europe and Northern Europe than they had been otherwise deployed. First of all, you don't make decisions in a fit of anger. I mean, that's catastrophic. And then secondly, what Medvedev does is that he says things publicly that Putin absolutely refuses to say publicly. Remember, Putin's argument is, let's have private discussions. We can sit and talk about this in private. We don't discuss these matters in public, not because we want to keep everything hopelessly secret from the publics in Europe or the United States or Russia, but you can't make much progress when someone on the other side, and this is particularly true for President Trump, is exploiting the opportunity for some sort of political gain at home. And Putin wants nothing to do with that. So Medvedev, from time to time, steps out and he'll say something that Putin probably agrees with, but would never say himself. And I think that's what's happened. And Trump, President Trump, who is the head of state as well as the political leader of the country, would bother responding is really the question on my mind. Respond to President Putin by all means, but don't respond to Medvedev. He may be in the inner circle, but let's not impute to him anything more than an attack dog role, and understand what that is. I mean, the Russians don't like Lindsey Graham, but I can tell you that President Putin listens to what President Trump says, not to what Lindsey Graham says.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I want to just for those who may not know, because for some, 1987 will be ancient history, but I want to get kind of a running start to see what this INF treaty was supposed to mean for American interest and American national security, and then how that changed in 2019. So first of all, here is a short piece from Ronald Reagan's announcement on the day he signed the INF treaty in 1987.
This treaty protects the interests of America's friends and allies. It also embodies another important principle, the need for glasnost, a greater openness in military programs and forces. We can only hope that this history-making agreement will not be an end in itself, but the beginning of a working relationship that will enable us to tackle the other issues, urgent issues before us. Strategic offensive nuclear weapons, the balance of conventional forces in Europe, the destructive and tragic regional conflicts that beset so many parts of our globe, and respect for the human and natural rights that God has granted to all men.
Now, obviously, that kind of gets to what you said a second ago, that aside from the specific issue of the terms of the treaty, whether they're being abided by or not, is one thing, but it also provides additional things, opportunities to talk to prevent any kind of general war, because they were really motivated, Reagan was, by preventing any kind of nuclear conflict. That seems to be the genesis of it for sure. But let me ask you, was his concern that he said, we don't want this to go in this other direction here because that wouldn't be good for us, was that borne out?
You know, I think the INF treaty was a step in the right direction. It did produce openness. From our standpoint, it helped to eliminate a category of very dangerous weapons for all intents and purposes. That meant that both sides agreed, you know, we're not going to use these. As soon as you decide not to use a particular category of nuclear weapons, that sends a hugely important signal to everyone. It means neither side wants to go to nuclear war. Very, very important. Now, the other thing that Reagan did mention, but was very important at the time, was to keep Germany inside the NATO alliance. And I can't stress that enough, because there were attitudes in Germany among many people that this is something they didn't want. They did not want nuclear weapons on German soil. And actually speaking, Eisenhower struggled with this in the 1950s. And he was approached about something very similar. Said, well, you have to put nuclear weapons into Germany. He says, I don't want to. And he said, by the way, if we put them there and the Soviets attack, they're in such overwhelming numbers, they'll overrun the nuclear weapons before we get a chance to use them. So he said, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, they should be at sea, or they could be delivered by the Air Force, or they should be on the periphery. In other words, perhaps Norway, Iceland, or North Africa, but not in Central East Europe. Ultimately, he reneged because people said, no, again, we can't get the Germans to stay in the alliance if we don't promise to protect them. And that means we have to put nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany, because that then becomes a last minute trigger for the use of strategic nuclear weapons if it looks like Germany could possibly be overrun. And that's the past. Here we are today. What are we doing right now? Well, as I said before, we've kept New START in existence. So on the strategic level, we're still abiding largely by the guidelines that define launchers and warheads for strategic nuclear weapons. That's a very good thing. I think it's a very bad thing that we've opened up this can of worms, though, with the INF, because the missiles that we see now, you look at the Oreshnik, for instance, we can't stop it. We can't stop any of these hypersonic missiles. We can have hypersonic missiles launched from any number of different locations, and we can't stop them. We need to get that across. The most recent studies by NATO suggested that they could only defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory with air and missile defense. So who are we kidding?
Yeah.
You're talking about going to war. You've lost your mind. Today, I was sent a report from a source inside NATO about the transportation infrastructure and rail lines. It said, we're not prepared for a large-scale war. The transportation infrastructure is not sufficiently developed. We don't have control of it. We don't have any means of protecting it. So again, it's just craziness on steroids. I think it was James Madison in Federalist number 10 who said, we may not always have especially bright, capable, intelligent, and informed statesmen at the helm. In other words, he was talking about the White House. Therefore, we have the Supreme Court. Therefore, we have Congress and so forth. Well, we don't have very many enlightened people anywhere right now.
Right, yeah.
They're out of touch with reality. They don't get it. Every single exercise, and I certainly saw several of these. You may have as well, but I certainly did, particularly when I was a full colonel and I monitored these things and I was able to read about them, particularly when I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. All the exercises and simulations that involved direct conflict with the Soviets, they all reached the same conclusion. Inevitably, if we go to war with these people, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. It's very simple. We can't field enough conventional forces. We started back in the 1960s. We developed this thing called flexible response. We were trying to find any way we could to sort of keep the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons very, very high. But nevertheless, in all of these, we inevitably went to the use of a nuclear weapon. Then the other conclusion was, well, if we do this, we can't control escalation. Whereas once you use a nuclear weapon, it's over. And then finally, General Powell in the early 1990s, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he said, don't come in here and tell me we could drop a tactical nuke on somebody and the Russians are not, or the Soviets are not going to say, that's a nuke. In other words, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's a low-yield nuclear weapon. That's not going to lead to any major country. He says, that's just crazy. That's complete nonsense. So the conclusion that everybody reached, I don't want to say everybody because there are always outliers, but the majority of senior military leaders, and I would argue even on the Hill, people like Sam Nunn and others had reached the conclusion that you wanted to avoid war with the Soviets at all cost. Well, all of a sudden now you've got a president who seems to be going out of his way to provoke the Russians. And he now has as one of his spokesmen a 4-star general who is threatening Russian national sovereign territory around Kaliningrad, this little enclave of East Prussia that FDR gave Stalin at the end of the war, or in the spring of 1945. That's unfortunate. I don't think FDR should have done that, but then again, there are a lot of things that FDR should not have done, but it's irrelevant now. It's water.
Yeah, it is.
That's now Russian national territory. If you attack it, everything is fair game. You're going to be at war with the Russian state. Now this is nuts. This is insane. No sitting general officer should announce to the world any intentions, or confirm. This is even more important if you're a Russian intelligence officer. This is a bonanza, because he's just confirmed that these aren't just intentions. We have plans.
Plans, yeah.
Insane. What planet are these people on? Listen, I don't think this is something, by the way, that this General Donahue cooked up. I think he was given leave to say this. Did he suggest it? Maybe. I don't know. But I think he had been given the green light to do it, which worries me even more, because that suggests that you have people in the SecDef's office as well as in the White House that are out of touch with reality. You don't want to go down this road for the reasons I just answered. We've been avoiding this stuff for 60 years?
Right.
All of a sudden now it's okay. Have these people lost their minds? I don't know, but it's back to Madison. We will not always have enlightened men at the helm of state. No kidding.
Well, and this whole situation here started not just recently, but under the first President Trump term. Here's what he said in 2019 when we got out, claiming that the Russians were cheating.
But for the last few years, the U.S. says Russia has developed and deployed this missile on display last week in Moscow that violates the treaty, and Russia refused U.S. requests to destroy it. Today, President Trump said as long as Russia wasn't abiding by the treaty, neither would the U.S.
So unless we're going to have something that we all agree to, we can't be put at the disadvantage of going by a treaty, limiting what we do when somebody else doesn't go by that treaty.
But the Russians say this American missile defense system in Romania could be modified to launch an offensive missile, and therefore the U.S. is the violator. Today, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov called the U.S. suspension a mistake.
We think that the agreement is essential. It is within interests of our security and European security, and it would be irresponsible for one side to shatter it.
So what do you think about that claim at the time that President Trump made that the Russians were cheating on with that missile that they were showing on the screen there, and therefore that's why we got out?
Well, let's go back to what the last Russian said or talked about, which is the air and missile defense installation in Romania. Remember, this is something that we established there ostensibly for the purpose of protecting Europe from Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, let's stop and consider that for a minute. Here's Iran, and this is what year, 2019?
Right.
And has never expressed any interest in or any intention under any circumstances to attack anyone in the world with anything except Israel in response to an attack. Now, that I didn't even mention ballistic missiles, but we put this thing into Romania and said that with the radars and the anti-missile missiles, these things pose no threat to Russia. This was entirely focused on Iran. Well, I'm sure the Russians doubled over in laughter. Why would they ever believe such a thing? When I was on active duty, I suggested that in order to allay Russian fears, which I quickly found out nobody gave a damn about, was to invite the Russians to inspect the facility, to satisfy themselves that this facility was, in fact, not aimed at them. So, well, that's ridiculous, McGregor. You've lost your mind. We're never going to do such a thing. Well, that's what you do if you don't want a war.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've talked about this before, and it's never a guarantee that it will work. But for decades, you had a personal adjutant, we would say aide de camp, assigned to the German emperor, one assigned to the Russian emperor, and one assigned to the emperor in Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Each one represented an emperor from the other camp. And this was designed to ensure that personal communications between the three could occur regardless of the circumstances, conditions, crises, conflicts, whatever. That ultimately falls apart in 1914. Actually, it fell apart a little bit before then, but it was a good idea. There is no reason why we should not have a system between Beijing, Moscow, and the United States to deal routinely all the time with these matters. We should have liaison officers here from those two nations, and ours should be where they are. The whole thing is to allay fear. In other words, to build confidence, reassure that there is no intention to strike anybody. Now, again, somebody will say, well, McGregor, you've lost your mind. You know, we deter these people because they don't know what we'll do. Very, very dangerous position to take with nuclear weapons. It's very easy to misinterpret any kind of action we may take any number of different places as evidence for an imminent strike. And
Right.
The same thing is true today for us. We don't know enough about Russia. We used to know a great deal more. We don't know very much right now. And I think the Russians don't really understand early warning. And I think Ted Postal has spoken to you about this, may have spoken to others, that their early warning system leaves much to be desired. We ought to be interested in those things. Instead, we are actively provoking, offending, insulting, and attacking people on every conceivable level. And people need to understand that sanctions are not harmless, that what they are meant to do damage. And most people, most of the time in the world, regard the use of economic sanctions as an act of war. We need to get out of that business.
And you know, some of these concerns that are playing out, some of which you just mentioned, were listed in 2019 by a European Federica Mogherini, who was worried about the development in the negative direction.
Today, NATO backed the U.S. accusation against Russia, but some European officials, like EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini, fear the start of a new arms race. From the late 70s to the late 80s, the Soviet Union and the U.S. deployed mobile, nuclear-tipped missiles to Europe. The INF eliminated them, and European officials say they don't want to turn back the clock.
What we definitely don't want to see is our continent going back to being a battlefield or a place where other superpowers confront themselves. This belongs to a faraway history.
And now that faraway history is run back up. I mean, you literally just described the very scenario she feared about.
Yeah, well, here we are. And I think it's gotten worse because this is really about Trump, who thinks he's leading a crusade against BRICS. He's trying to bash, bully, intimidate anyone who does business with Russia. He's tried to do that to China. It's all failed miserably. None of it is going to change anything. Fighting BRICS is a losing battle at this stage. If anything, BRICS is a consequence of our behavior in the past. People are just really tired of being bullied by us through the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT system. This is what de-dollarization is all about. And I think that President Trump and his advisors undoubtedly have told him this, that you can use the strategic military dimension as a way to leverage our power against BRICS. And of course, you have the other problem is the same people that want us to go to war in the Middle East all the time are the same people that are pushing war against Russia, even though they keep insisting, well, we're not talking about a direct confrontation. Well, if you're not talking about a direct confrontation, you certainly sound like it. And they hate Russia. They hate it because it's the primary fortress holding out against globalism. And President Trump, who we thought we elected because he was not a globalist, seems to have taken on the mantle of leadership for globalism. So destroy Russia, destroy Orthodox Christianity, destroy the population, destroy its people, strip it of resources, on and on and on. It's just insane. It's crazy. It's all failed. There's no chance that it's going to happen anytime soon. But nevertheless, he's leading this now. I don't even think he understands what he's leading. This is not something in the interest of the American people or the United States.